What happens when two bass road warriors spend quality time talking music and life with one of their peers? Find out every Monday at 8 on Notes from an Artist. Bassist, educator, author David C. Gross and bassist and head honcho of KnowYourBassPlayer.com, Tom Semioli, trade dates with the legends of rock, jazz, funk, blues, folk, country, and more. Notes from an Artist. Revealing conversations with the legends who've created the soundtrack of our lives. Every Monday at 8 on CygnusRadio.com. And check out previous episodes on our podcast. NotesFromAnArtist.buzzsprout.com.
Hi, this is David Gross, and along with co-host Tom Semioli, I want to welcome you to another edition of Notes from an Artist. For the next 2 weeks, we will be welcoming John Altman to our show. I'm sure some of you are going, 2 weeks with John Altman? Who's John Altman? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. First and foremost, John Altman is a great guy, and I've had the privilege of being friends with him for the past 5 years. Moreover, here's a quick bio of some, and I do mean some, of his credentials. He's a saxophonist, rather a saxophonist, and has played, recorded, composed, arranged, conducted, and let's now add author to the list. Let's see, Peter Green, Eric Clapton, Little Richard, Jimi Hendrix, Nick Drake, Van Morrison, Monty Python, the Titanic soundtrack, Rod Stewart, George Michael, Amy Winehouse. Okay, enough. Now you can understand why we were taking 2 weeks for some incredible stories and remembrances from a wonderful guy. Let's begin our conversation with John Altman. Hi, Tom. Hi, John.
It's great to see you. It's been a couple years now since you've been 3 years, actually.
5 years.
Oh, God, we're getting old. Well, you look well.
Yeah, I feel great.
You remember Denny Sewell, right?
Of course.
So Denny's telling us a story about Joe Venuti with
cutting the stick down.
the practical joker.
Oh,
he had this guitar player, an old guitar player who had a walking stick.
Yeah.
And every night he would take a 1/4 inch off the stick. Yes.
Another thing he used to do was he would fill the double bass with sand every night. And the bass player would eventually said, "Look, I've got to leave. I can't carry this thing around anymore. I'm getting so old."
Well, what about the thing he did with all those bass players when he called them all for the gig?
I know.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So we've been having a wonderful time. We had Richard Thompson yesterday.
Oh, fantastic.
We were telling stories. I saw him in '69 at Alice Tully Hall, which was 3 blocks from my house. I then told him I saw him in '89, which was about 4 miles from the house. And if convenient, could he book his dates so I don't have to go more than 4 miles to see him?
You know, I've never played music with him, but I played cricket with him.
Oh, okay.
How weird is that?
Well, that's weird because you've actually played with everybody.
Yeah. I don't
Technically.
know, but we missed each other.
So today we just want to talk about This Is Your Life, John Altman, because it's such a fascinating life. It really is.
Yeah.
Well, you were born on the cusp of the rock and roll era, but your roots are in jazz. You had Wolf and Sid Phillips, who worked with Judy Garland, Sinatra, Nat King Cole, Bert Ambrose. Take us back to the 50s in London before the Beatles changed the musical landscape. What was it like back then?
Well, of course, in the 50s, I was not yet 10 years old. I reached 10.
Okay, well, early 60s, yeah.
But what was interesting to me was that my family obviously were heavily in music. And at home, we had a gramophone with a radiogram in those days, the combined radio and record player. And we had lots of 78s. And I don't ever remember my parents putting 78 records on. Not at all. I found them when I was about 3. And instead of throwing them across the room or jumping on them or making flower pots, I played them. And I made as you don't, when you're 3, 4, 5 years old.
Right.
No distinction between Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Beethoven. It was all music. By the time I was 7 or 8, I just had a sort of compendium knowledge of what music was, and good music, because...
Yeah.
And then when sort of Elvis came out and rock and roll, all my peers were listening to Elvis and all that. And I went, oh, yeah, that sounds good as well. I'll add that to what I listen to. I never went, because I've heard that, I don't want to hear this anymore. Or
there was no snobbery.
None at all. So when I took piano lessons from 7 till 11, the ages.
Good.
And then I moved school and I got a new piano teacher. And the first lesson, he said, right, your fingering is all wrong. Your posture is all wrong. Your this is all wrong. We're going back to the beginning. And I went, oh, no, we're not. And then that was the end of that.
Well,
So,
you were one of the few young people in England that didn't have, Bert Whedon playing a day?
no, I don't play guitar.
But I'm just, it seems like everyone we've spoken to, that's how they've gotten their start. And you can,
started, yeah. I worked with Bert Whedon, but I never played the Bert Whedon book. But I got really started when I was 12, coming up to 13. I'd always wanted to play saxophone. I don't know why. It just appealed to me. So my uncle brought a saxophone round, got it on Friday night, and I did a gig on Saturday night.
why wouldn't you, right?
I would. God knows how awful it was, but I was already playing in local blues bands. And
You just need to know one scale, right, David? Your blues scale.
Well, I'm thinking you got your saxophone, and then a couple of days later you're doing a gig. It sounds like bass players who watch YouTube these days.
Yeah, but there was nobody showed me how, what my uncle showed me how to make a noise on it. And because I played recorder at school, the fingering wasn't difficult,
Yeah, sure.
Exactly.
Right, you do that and you do that. When I was 11, I won a scholarship to a very prestigious school. And my parents, as a treat, bought me a dance set record player, which in those days every British kid had to have a dance set. And I went out and I bought 3 albums. And it's sort of indicative for an 11-year-old.
What were they?
Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto, Dick Spiderbeck and his gang, and Charlie Parker on Savoy.
Oh, good choices.
This is an 11-year-old kid, How mad is that?
Was Anna Fedorova doing Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto, followed by Bix Beiderbecke doing Singing the Blues, followed by Red Cross by Charlie Parker. This is Notes from That was Bill Haley and the Comets doing Rock Around the Clock. This is CygnusRadio.com's Notes from an Artist. We're talking with John Altman, and let's get back to our conversation.
If I'd have grown up not hearing that, but just hearing British bands sort of crooners and the equivalent of, Pat Boone and people like that.
Right.
This was just a complete revelation to hear that music played like that. And I think that's what the blues players did. They brought that authenticity to what they were playing, and it just felt right.
Comment on the irony that the British taught us about our own music.
Yeah, then it moved back.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing there, I was slightly late because I obviously in 63, 64, 65. By the time I was 65, I was doing larger gigs, but I was only 15, 16 years. What was interesting was that, for example, the Rolling Stones, and I've been very friendly with Bill Wyman.
Yeah.
We played cricket together, and we talked about this. And Bill, of course, said, we went from playing at the small clubs that you played at, huge stadiums in America, in about 3 months. It wasn't like a gradual stepping up. It went boom, boom. And also, I would go to gigs and I'd hear Ellington and I'd hear Basie but I also would go, I was at the only 2 gigs that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones appeared on the same bill together. Not that I heard a note either. Yeah. It was just screams and hideous noise, One was at the Albert Hall and one was at the Wembley, the Empire Pool is now the Arena.
You were listening to 2 live tracks. One, the Rolling Stones doing Under My Thumb in Manchester, England, and that was in 1965. And then, of course, the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl. You heard Twist and Shout. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
It was interesting because I learned many years later that Andrew Oldham had thrown a wobbly and said that the Stones don't go on if the Beatles are topping the bill. It's crazy.
There's another irony I actually more recently thought about with the fact that you brought the blues back to us, but another thing that you brought to us was musical theater.
Yeah, there was that huge revival, wasn't there, that came from England.
I think musicals in general, I think it was like 63, wasn't Oliver and shows like that? So it was almost like you were sort of showing us what we've forgotten.
Well, yeah, I think that's very true, because there was an excitement and an energy that British bands put into the music. Maybe it was a sort of inverted commas punk rawness.
Right, probably, yes.
Yeah,
So people like Muddy, who I got to know later in life, they were basically playing cabaret gigs, which they said to me. They were wearing shiny suits and playing for the diners and the drinkers. Suddenly, they come over to England and they're lionised and they're in rock concerts. They hadn't been in one of those since Alan Freed got busted,
Right.
So it was an interesting time, and you could go and see all kinds of people who were basically rescued from obscurity and treated here like huge stars. I had funny stories which going in my book, that I was on the station in London with a great guitar player called Andy Fernbach.
Okay.
And I said to him, or he said to me, "See that man down there?" And I said, yeah, there's an elderly black guy with a guitar. And I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "I think that's Mississippi Fred McDowell." And I said, "You may be right." He said, "Let's go over and say hello to him." So we marched down the platform and Andy says, "Excuse me, you're Mississippi Fred McDowell." And this man looked so terrified. He jumped back, and then he said, "How the hell do you know me?" He said, "Nobody knows me anywhere in the world." Anyway, we got quite friendly, and he was doing a concert down in Brighton, and Paul Oliver, who wrote Story of the Blues, very fine writer, came down and presented him with a copy of his book, which was inscribed to Fred McDowell in admiration, Paul Oliver. And Fred came over to me and sort of thrust it in my hand and said, "What does it say?" Because he couldn't read. I said, "Oh, it says to Fred McDowell in admiration, Paul Oliver." And he looked at me and said, "Is he famous?" And I said, "Well, he's probably the world's leading expert on the blues." He said, "Oh, good. I'll get a lot of money when I sell this back home."
That was Going Down the River, Mississippi Fred McDowell. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
Well, one of the people that you played with, we've spoken about when you were at the house and everything, is Peter Green.
Yeah.
Probably the greatest, in my mind, greatest guitar player in England. And
Mine too.
yeah. And so tell us a little bit about that, because that's a fascinating story.
It was interesting. I mean, I got to know him really by being around, first of all, John Mayall's Blues Breakers and then Fleetwood Mac. I would go to all their gigs, and Peter was very gregarious. He would say hello, or I'd buy him a drink at the bar, because in those days, as we discussed, if you went to see Jimi Hendrix or the Fleetwood Mac or whoever, you were basically in a room above a pub or Cream. You weren't actually in a sort of a venue, they were in your face. So at the interval, you would go up to the bar and say, "Oh, can I buy you a pint?" So Peter found out that I played sax, and the usual, "Oh, one day we should do something together." Think nothing of it. And then it got out. I mean, first of all, they suddenly upped their game, and they were doing Albatross and Green Manalishi and Oh Well and all these things. And I'm pretty certain the rest of the band just didn't have a clue what he was doing. It's like, "Oh, we'll humour him. We'll do Oh Well. We don't know what it is. And maybe he'll get it out of his system." But he decided to leave the band, and we contacted him and said, "We're having a free festival down in Brighton. Would you like to come?" And he said, yeah. So he showed up with his guitar, and we set up. And 8 hours later, we were still playing. Literally 8 hours later.
Wow.
And it was Sammy Mitchell, who played all the bottleneck guitar on the Rod Stewart records, who's no longer with us. Another one who's no longer with us, Jim Capaldi, was on drums.
Right.
And some local musicians, from Brighton. And we just played and played and played and played and played. And then over the next few months, basically from May to December 1970, whenever he would do a festival or a free gig or a benefit concert, which is mainly what he was up to then, I would get the call and go along and start playing. And people have often asked me, what was the music like? And it's impossible to describe unless you've got a tape of it somewhere. It was We never rehearsed. We never decided what tunes we were going to play. We would just start playing. He would start playing something on guitar. I would feed off him. Then he would feed off me. Then it would go round and round and round and round and on and on and on. It was amazing.
This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
I reconnected with him about 6 years ago, and he came to my big band concert.
Mm-hmm.
And it was wonderful. He stayed the whole night. I showed him pictures of us on stage, and he recognized Duster Bennett straight away, but he didn't recognize someone who was his closest friend at the time.
It's interesting because they really made him out to be like Syd Barrett.
No, he never was. Let me rephrase that. He may have been during the period that I didn't see him when he was on medication, because he did get very big and became a grave digger, and his fingernails were that long. And in fact, when I was with Van Morrison, Peter Bardens was the keyboard player.
Okay.
And Peter had Peter Green and Rod Stewart in his band. And Peter was still visiting Peter Green. And he told me, I'm visiting Peter tomorrow. And I said, oh, can I come? And he said, because you're my friend, no, it will upset you too much. You can't come. So what can you do?
Yeah.
But it's nice that Peter at least got recognition in his later years on the world stage, when I think they brought him up for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think they did.
Well, Santana did. I mean, Fleetwood Mac sort of ignored him. Hoped he'd go away. But funny enough, again, talking about people who are influences, I was backstage at Ronnie Scott's with Mike Stern, and a friend of mine was in the band. Daryl Jones was in the band, and Daryl said to Mike, "Oh, John used to play with Peter Green. Show him the picture." And I showed him the picture, and he just went potty. Oh, my biggest influence on guitar ever, and my hero, which surprised me, because I always thought of Mike Stern as a
jazzer.
Yeah, fusion guy,
yeah. That's very interesting. Very interesting. So at that point, then comes Van Morrison.
Yep, a few years later. Yeah.
You were doing session work at the time when you hooked up with Van, yes?
Yeah, I played a couple of years in Hot Chocolate, the band.
That was Hot Chocolate doing You Sexy Thing. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
I left them basically because I started getting work at the BBC Ranger doing takedown. So what that would entail, obviously, was, let's say the Stylistics came over to do some variety shows.
Right.
They wouldn't bring music with them. They would just show up, and they would be on with the orchestra at Top of the Pops or, one of the variety shows. So they would send me a cassette of their record that they wanted to plug, and I would write down what was on the record, because I have a very good ear. So I would write down all the parts, and then I'd adapt them for whatever the band was on the show. So if if there were 6 strings or something, or no woodwind, I'd put the woodwind parts on the strings or mess about, So I got to do a lot of that. I did Don Williams, I did Telly Savalas, which was great fun.
That's right, I remember.
Now we're talking.
Wonderful guy. I mean, I had such fun with him.
The lollipop. Did it now? But you didn't study arranging formally. So was it a situation like Frank Zappa, who says, "I just went to the library, took out books on arranging, and taught myself notation and all that"?
Pretty much. Even when I was 7, I could hear, again, going back to that period.
Right.
If I played a 78, say Count Basie's Texas Shuffle, it's a tune, but it's an arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
And it has solos. Now, as a 7-year-old, it was all one. The sax is playing, the trumpet's playing, the trombone's playing, Lester Young plays. I didn't know he was soloing. I just thought, this is part of the record,
Okay.
Right.
So I imbued, and I still can, I can sing solos and arrangements off by heart. And it seems to be a family gene, because that's exactly what my uncles did. None of them had any lessons. It's extraordinary. And I could just do it. I never thought, I'll make a career of it, but...
That was Count Basie doing the Texas Shuffle. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
For example, when I joined Hot Chocolate, they said, "I haven't got any music." And I said, don't worry, I'll listen to the records and I'll write down what's being played on them. And then they said, "We got it all the time. We just wanted to see how committed you were." But Van, bless him, I'd got to know him and played with him a few times. And he asked me to join the band and basically rewrite all the charts. And just gave me complete free rein, just do whatever you want and tell me when to come in, which was great. For me, it was really lucky. I played alto and baritone and a bit of flute and clarinet.
And you were also on the road with him for a couple of years.
Yeah. I had a great time. Again, the same thing. I'm getting a lot of film work. I'd just done Monty Python, Life of Brian and the Ruttles.
But Brian, you know what they say? Some things in life are bad. They can really make you mad. Other things just make you swear and curse. When you're chewing on life's gristle, don't grumble, give a whistle. And this'll help things turn out for the best.
Just heard John Altman's orchestral arrangements on 2 tunes. One, which he co-wrote, the Monty Python tune, Always Look on the Bright Side of Life, and 2, the Ruttles, Piggy in the Middle. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
I actually thought, do you know what? I don't really want to be at someone's whim. Like you hear that a certain big name comes down and goes, oh, your face doesn't fit anymore. Bye-bye. And then what mileage is there in being, I used to be with Paul McCartney or Eric Clapton or whatever.
Yeah.
How many years you've done with them.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going around, David. Yes. Yeah.
Yes, there is.
I mean, there's no mileage in it. And I thought, do you know what? If I'm doing movies, and I'd done a David Bowie movie as well, and I was doing TV drama and TV variety, I was conducting big music variety shows with, I mean, I can't believe some of the people I work with, like Shaka and Run DMC and Cameo and Frankie Goes to Hollywood and Spandau Ballet and the Moody Blues. And I'm producing all of them for television and playing with them occasionally and conducting them, the Weather Girls. So I just decided, right, I'm off the road. That's my look. And really, through the 80s, that's all I did. I didn't go on holiday or anything, have a vacation. I just work. And because it was so varied and I was doing commercials as well, that became my day-to-day life. So I would wake up and go, right, I've got 3 commercials to write, a cue for a movie, an arrangement for George Michael, and a TV drama. Right, I better get on with it,
Not a bad schedule.
Well, it's interesting because Dave Swift, sort of tells a similar story about, working with Jules over the last 30 years. People would come in with music. People would come in without music. He'd have a cassette. He'd have to write everything out himself. That was basically how he lived his life. And I want to go back, though, because Ruttles, you gloss over the Ruttles and Monty Python. Quick story. I was telling Richard Thompson, I said, one night, it's the coldest night in New York. We're going to the bitter end to see Sandy Denny.
All right.
It was so cold that myself and my 2 friends were the only people in the audience. She did her first show, came out, sat with us, and said, have you guys heard Monty Python? I said, no, what kind of music is it? It's what happens when you're 17 and public television didn't show it as yet.
No. The reason I got with them was that they made records in those days because there were no VCRs.
No YouTube.
Yep, if you missed the show, you missed the show. That was the end of it.
Yeah.
So they had a record deal with, I think it was Charisma, actually.
It was Arista over here, and I think there was Matching Tie and Handkerchief, your record. Wasn't that the 3-sided record?
Yeah.
There you go.
I'm on it. Unfortunately, I'm not playing. I'm singing and clapping hands. And you can hear my voice.
Well, you did that live as well.
Yeah. And then I went to, I did their live shows. And then up came, as I said, the Ruttles and Life of Brian, both at the same time, virtually.
When you came up with the arrangement for Always Think on the Bright Side of Life, which, of course, now, David, it's like Here Comes the Bride. I mean, it's one of the most popular songs. I think it's the number 1 song at funerals now, right?
It is. Yep.
Wow.
It really is.
Eric just came to you with a guitar demo, right?
Yeah. They didn't know how to end the film. And Eric wrote the song, which he played to them to distinct apathy. They were sat there and, oh, God, And he sent it to me and said, maybe we can do something with it. And I heard it, and he said, it should be like a Hollywood musical,
Right, yeah, dance hall, right, yeah.
And I just ran with that. And that was what I did. I basically did a Hollywood musical arrangement of it. But again, it was never demoed or anything like that. We just went in the studio and, and off we go. We're doing it.
Any inclination that it would be such a massive hit?
Not a clue. The funny thing about doing it, I think, was that Terry Jones, bless him, hated the song. Michael Palin was sort of, well, it's all right, Tom Cleese was, how long do we have to stay on this bloody cross? And then suddenly it's iconic.
Yeah.
The nice thing about it was the original record was produced by George Harrison.
Right, who used to serenade you with verses from the
he
song.
He would sing my arrangement to me. Amazing. He would never say my name. He would just look at me and sing my arrangement.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah.
Talk about being a producer arranger. What is basically your approach to the artist? Because there are producers that want to bring the artist's vision to fruition, and then there are producers and arrangers that are essentially song doctors. Do you take it case by case, or?
Yeah, I mean, what I always did, if I got called to write an arrangement for, say, Rod Stewart or Tina Turner or Diana Ross or whoever, there's a fine balance, obviously, between what have people done for them in the past and what sets them off to their biggest advantage, and how do you make yourself a statement that people will say, oh yeah, I know who did that arrangement.
That was Rod Stewart doing Downtown Train with our guest John Altman's arrangement. Let's get back to our discussion. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
You can tell Nelson Riddle, Gil Evans, Henry Mancini, George Martin, Paul Buckmaster, you could hear their arrangements. It's almost they make their print on that. Yeah.
I sort of thought that there would be an organic thing, which was, however I approached it, it would come through because I'm the person doing it. So rather than say, oh, I've got to have trilling flutes on the third bar because that's my signature, I would write and I would think, well, nobody else is going to write it like this. And that was my approach to doing movies as well.
Okay.
If I got a film score, I thought, they've hired me, they want me, I'm going to write what I feel is right for the project, but there will be enough of me in it to make people say, oh, yeah, I'm glad he did that. Or something like that.
We were just listening to 3 tracks from John Altman's film work. The first one was the chase scene from GoldenEye, the James Bond movie. We then went to a tune that was in the movie Little Voice called Get Happy, and we ended with a Mark Ronson tune, Johanna, from the movie Mordecai. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
Touch wood, it always worked. I'd never had an arrangement rejected by any artist. All the major film cues that I've been associated with, I've never demoed. The 3 big ones that everyone knows, the tank chasing GoldenEye, Always Look on the Bright Side of Life, and the ship sinking in Titanic.
That was It's Oh So Quiet by Bjork. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
You talk about the magic of arranging and producing for artists. What is the secret to writing an effective commercial jingle? I mean, obviously it's the hook, but now, we're in the age of algorithms now where a hook has to appear every 14 seconds. Now, jingles in the United States nowadays, David, right? They're old rock songs. I think the 80s hair bands now, Whitesnake and Rat and even David Bowie and Beatles songs are commercials. But what's the key to writing a commercial jingle?
Well, very interestingly, and it sort of bounces off what you were saying, but it's a sidetrack. But when I was doing commercials a lot in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s,
right,
record companies looked down on advertising, refused to use their tracks.
It was selling out.
Yeah, we're not having our music on the commercial, cheapening our music.
Yeah.
So you had to re-record everything. It was, if you were doing Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, you had to get somebody who sounded like Otis Redding. If you were doing Heard It Through the Grapevine, you got a Marvin Gaye sound alike.
We had a similar situation in New York. When I used to do session work, you couldn't play a Duran Duran song, which was a hit, but we would come up with a song that kind of sounded like Duran Duran. As a matter of fact, I had to go to Denmark Street and buy an aria bass like he had just to get that tone. But it was sort of like, you would copy what was big, the Thompson Twins and George Michael and that Gotta Have Faith groove. And then, of course, record companies woke up. One of the accountants woke up and said, hey, there's money in this. There's gold in them there commercials.
Yeah. And it was the same with movies. If movies wanted a song, the price would be prohibitive. So So they would come to you and say, oh, can you write a song for this film? We can't afford to have any of the songs that we want. And I think that still goes on to an extent.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. You know, it's interesting because I was going to get into this too. There's a Sirius XM channel called Radio Classics, which basically is radio programs from the 30s, 40s, and 50s up until about 1961. So some of them actually have the commercials still in them. The commercials sound like game show music. And of course, the game show music sounds like the commercials. But Tom, you hit a good point. There's gold in them there, Hills, because the boomers buy not so much albums anymore, but to hear the jingle of that particular song, it's boom. Oh, yeah, let's go. So, and oddly enough, if you think about it, it's probably more cost prohibitive to get a Beatles tune or a Whitesnake tune than it would be to have people do an approximation.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You know.
But the interesting thing about advertising, it's sort of gone a bit like that, because in the 60s and 70s, when I first started writing commercials, American advertising was very much, here's the product, buy it, here it is again, buy it again, jingle, bye-bye. Next one.
What you were just listening to is actually two things. The first was a 1967 Noxzema commercial, followed by the Ridley Scott directed Prada commercial that John Altman arranged, composed. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
My wife comments on the fact, she lived in France for 12 years, and she said she fell in love with commercials because they were mini movies. They were entities unto themselves. It wasn't the American product in your face.
Now that's changed. The British advertising is now like that, whereas the American one has got more subtle.
Well, gosh, it's amazing, David. Wasn't it? I think Nick Drake actually became a star in the United States from a car commercial.
Pink Moon, yeah. Put in my book about the evening I spent with Nick Drake trying to talk him out of not performing in public. Yeah, that's a story.
Oh, well, obviously we're going to have you back on when that book's out. That's for sure.
We're going to sell books for you.
Have they asked you to, you're going to narrate it, of course, for Audible, correct?
I hope so. I also hope that maybe somebody with a much more high profile is going to narrate it. Let's see. Richard
Thompson was talking about B-Swing and how it was so convenient because you could do the whole thing at home.
Yes. The interesting thing, I got testimonials, inverted commas, for the cover. But I contacted a bunch of people I've worked with or been friends with for years, and they all came back with sound bites. I have this amazing assortment of pats on the back, whatever you want to call it. So I've got Quincy Jones, Hans Zimmer, John Batiste, Joss Stone, Michael Palin, Terry Gilliam, Jim Carter from Downton Abbey, and Jeff Goldblum.
Oh, wow.
And they've all written something about me, which is, I'm completely blown away.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And Jeff's now playing jazz, right?
Yeah, I gig with him when I can.
Oh, really?
When he comes to England, I play sax with him.
Yeah.
And if I'm in LA, I play with him.
Sure.
But the thing about Jeff is he surrounds himself with great musicians, and he's not afraid to showcase them and to talk about them. If he's on a chat show, he'll deflect the questioning away from Jurassic Park or Independence Day and say, oh, look, I've got Ralph Moore on saxophone or Kenny Elliott on drums. How about that? Joe Bagg is playing organ. Yeah. And most of the interviewers couldn't care less who's playing the organ, making that point, which I love him for, like 25 years, and love working with him.
Take us back. I wanted to ask you about doing session work again. I visited the home of Mo Foster. I don't know if you've ever been to it. It's a museum, right?
I know.
I think Mo should charge admission to his home, put himself behind the glass and, charge an extra. And he was telling me a funny story about in the early days of session work when rock players would come in. And I think he was doing a session with the London Symphony Orchestra, and he couldn't read yet. Right. So he was just there with his Fender electric bass playing along what he thought was good. The conductor stopped the session and said, you there, bass player, could you play measures 91 through 150? And he was, frozen for a second. And then he just played his funky Mo Foster bass. And the conductor said, well, that's not what I wrote, but no, it sounds good. We're young. And of course, you have to hear Mo say it over a plate of Vindaloo when he does. Yeah. Was there a sense in that day when the rock and the young jazz players were coming in that the older producers didn't know the language? So they said, okay, you just do it.
Yeah, there was a turnaround, which I believe, for example, that I got all that work from Powers That Be at the BBC.
Right.
Because none of the dance band arrangers on the staff wanted to go anywhere near it. So if it was country, reggae, funk, anything like that, give it to the young guy. We can't do it. We don't want to do it.
Right. John Paul Jones, right, was probably in
John Paul was very much on the scene. By the time I got in, he was off with Led Zeppelin.
Oh, okay.
As was Jimmy. I went to Led Zeppelin's first ever gig.
Ah, okay.
My ears are still recovering. The generation that came in with me was very interesting because I have to say, on the whole, they did read music and they were very good players. They also understood the new disciplines of reggae and funk. And, if you said Earth, Wind and Fire, you wouldn't get a blank look from the session player. They knew what to do. There was a switchover. I did use a lot of the older players, particularly in my big band. I had people in their 70s at the same time as I had a 16-year-old sax player. So I enjoyed that mix-up of age groups and the sort of creative clash, if you like, of culture. Yeah. Somebody who was 16 and just knew David Sanborn or whatever would sit to a guy who'd been in the dance bands in 1930, so it was an interesting time. I very rarely would work, for example, if they wanted let's say, a pedal steel guitar player and he came in and said, oh, I'm sorry, I can't really read music. I would say, okay, well, look, you basically got to play a slide up to a G chord on bar 8 and I'll cue you in. The whole thing never came to a halt because somebody wasn't on the page.
Well, you could just reference Sneaky Pete, right? I mean, that was the go-to guy.
Yeah. Well, I loved using BJ Cole, who would come in every time and say, I can't read. And then he'd do it perfectly. It's amazing. 40, 50 years of having him on sessions.
Let's fast forward to modern times with Pro Tools. And now Pro Tools is ubiquitous. You can record, heck, David, we can make a record on our iPhones now.
Precisely.
You have Pro Tools where now home studios are more cost effective. Gosh, what it probably costs for a session at Trident, you could probably buy yourself Pro Tools now. Is the focus less on education? Because if I can cut and paste an arrangement at home, why the heck should I spend years like you did on the bandstand or that kid with his 78s, giving yourself a music education, even though you probably didn't realize it at the time?
No, I think that's a very valid point. I found myself a bit of a Luddite because I always wrote pencil and paper. I don't have Pro Tools or anything like that, but I am an early endorser of Sibelius. And what happened in the days when you needed an Acorn computer to make it work, way back, Mike Price, who now writes Sherlock and all these wonderful shows, and Emmy winner, he came round to my house and he showed me what to do. And when he left, I thought, oh, I'm going to try it out. And I wrote Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on a piano part, got to the last bar and put a tie into the next bar. And the music carried on for 1,000 bars. And I was hitting everything inside. Stop, and it just kept going and going, page after page and I shut the computer down and never touched it ever again. About 6 years ago, I started writing library music, and they really wanted to hear not hear demos, but first 4 bars of what you're writing. So I thought, well, I'll get into Sibelius again. So I had someone come round and showed me what to do. And I thought, oh, I've got a choice here. I can either switch it off again for 10 years or try and work with it. And I chose the latter. And the next project after that, I scored a 100-minute silent film for the London Film Festival, which was 3,500 bars of music, which I could never have done on paper. But I did it all on Sibelius.
That was an extract from Shooting Stars, the 1928 silent film that John Altman composed. And folks, we're going to stop right here. This is the 2-hour mark, and we've got a lot more to talk about, and you'll get that next week. This is David Gross for Tom Semioli and John Altman, thanking you for listening. Next week, John Altman, Part 2. Have a great week. We'll see you soon. Take care.